Do you ever feel like the things you spend time on in the practice room, maybe scales, arpeggios, different licks, don't quite land in your playing when it actually matters? Do you feel like there's no sense of phrasing, no beginnings, no endings? Maybe your overall playing just has a little bit of a rambly nature to it. All of these are common challenges that we as improvisers face as we're trying to improve. Today, we're going to look at a little different practice strategy that can hopefully help you get back on the right track. That is using composition in the practice room to aid our growth as improvisers. What's up, everyone? Thanks for joining me. As always, today we're looking at a little different practice approach. This is one that I use from time to time, but I definitely have my students use quite often. If there's ever something they're working on and it's just not quite clicking, especially after spending some practice time on it, writing yourself out an etude is a great way to have a little bit of time to see, all right, well, how is this thing that I'm working on, regardless of what the concept is, how can I apply that into the song I'm working on and hopefully do it in a musical fashion? Today, we're going to use the Horace Silver composition Song for My Father as the jumping off point. Now, this is a relatively simple tune, something that most people would probably work on when they're in maybe the beginning or intermediate phase of practicing as improvisers. However, these concepts will work on any tune. I selected this one because it's really, really clear. There's not a lot of different chord changes, that sort of thing. So it's an easy place to see how some of these things can work on an easy tune, but you could totally apply this to any tune regardless of the difficulty level. So let's get into it. We've got to start with a very short amount of boring information. This will make your life better when you go through this process. That is literally just like how you go about writing this out. Now, if you're going to do this in a notation software, I would highly advise that you set up your page before you even write a single idea. So for me, I like to see 4 measures per line if it's sort of like a standard tune like this that has standard phrases. And then I like to write the chord changes in just with blank measures, just so you can see where everything is. That can give you some good direction as you're sort of thinking about your phrases, thinking about how different ideas are going to move through the changes. Now, if you're not using a notation software and you're going to write this out by hand, definitely use a pencil. You might want to change some few things as you're sort of working through it. If you want to skip this step entirely, check out the free handout that's available this week. Not only are a couple of starter ideas in there to kind of get you going at the beginning of each chorus, but there's also this entire song form for at least this tune, for Song for My Father, already mapped out there, all the different transpositions, all the different chords, all that kind of stuff. So you can download that, print it out, and then you can have that to write out rather than having to worry about this step if you so choose. Now that the boring stuff is out of the way, let's get into actually how we do this. So as I said, we're working on Song for My Father. Our first chord is an F minor 7 chord. What you want to think about before you even write anything on the page is, what are you really trying to work on? What concept are you trying to improve on? Is this a certain lick? Is it a scale? Is it a harmonic concept? So just to kind of show you what's going on with this way of thinking, I'm going to say we're going to work on modes and our modal playing. This is something I tend to find students have a hard time getting from sort of a concept. They might know their modes, but moving it into a musical fashion seems to be difficult. Most people end up just playing lines up and down the scale without a lot of phrasing, without a lot of direction. That is what we're trying to sort of work out with this approach. Since we're working on modes, we know we're probably going to have stepwise motion. We do want to be familiar with all the modes of the song, but here we're just really about, what's my starting idea? What am I going to play on F minor? So we could go in lots of different directions. All those could be potentially good starting points with a million other options. What you want to think about is what an actual idea is. Not just I'm going to run up and down the mode in this case, but what is an actual idea I might play in my solo? So I'm going to choose that last one that we did. That's going to be my starting point. So I would put that in my first measure of my tune. Now this does have a pickup note in it, so you would have to maybe change or finesse what you had written on the page already. And that's just kind of how it goes sometimes when doing this. I would still encourage you to write that all the form and everything out ahead of time. So once we have that idea, our first inclination might be to just like move it through all the chords of the tune. That would be a much more exercise approach to how you would go about doing this. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with that. That's an important step to be able to do as an improviser, just transposing a given idea through the different chords, see how it works across major and minor chords in this case, but not really what we're trying to do here. We want to think how we can do this in a more musical fashion. If we just played a solo like that, where we're just cutting and pasting an idea through the whole thing, it's probably not going to be very satisfying. So we want to think about how we can extend these ideas and how we can connect the ideas. So we have our F minor 7 idea where we just kind of go from the fifth up to the root, up and down the mode. Rather than just doing the same thing on E flat 7, what if I just change it a little bit? Think about how I can extend that. Maybe I keep going up the mode a little bit more before I come back down. Just gives it a little bit different twist. To me, makes it feel like a natural sense of phrasing that I had one idea, I elaborate on it just a little bit for the next idea. From there, we might want to think about how do these two ideas connect. Right now, it feels very much like F minor 7 over here, E flat dominant 7 over here. How can we connect them in a musical fashion while still keeping our main idea of staying within the mode? Now, I think this really gets at the key point of why we might want to compose something like this. If you look at this example, you'll see my first idea, first measure, is exactly the same. I just tacked on a little bit to think how I could round that off and then start to work towards that E flat on the downbeat of the E flat dominant 7th chord. Now, I did change it a little bit. I didn't go from the 5th, the B flat, to the E flat to get to that chord. Instead, I looked for closer resolution notes, and I also have a passing note in there. Now, if you're just starting to work on your modes, putting that all together like on the spot when you're soloing in time might be challenging. But if you have a little time to think about it, maybe a little time to experiment, you might be able to come up with that sort of connection. You work that a couple times and it can help to build how you move through chords in this fashion. So if we take that all the way to the next step and do that through an entire A section, we can hear how I'll always be looking for moving through the mode in stepwise motion, but then looking for close resolution notes. That's really what you need to do to make these modes into little musical passages where you think I'm coming from one place on one chord, I'm going to a resolution point on the next chord. Having time to think through that in a compositional fashion really, really helps connect these dots. Now, that is still a pretty notey example. It's not quite an exercise, but it's borderline. If we want to really move this into some musical examples, we might want to think about just working on some other concepts possibly. Our second concept we're going to talk about today is the idea of motivic preservation or motivic development. So to work this, I would again start with your blank A section or your blank chorus of whatever tune you're working on and think about some motives that would work well in this tune. I really love things that combine maybe one larger interval and then a couple of smaller intervals. Those tend to be really nice, very melodic sounding. In this case, we're going to use that motive. It's from the 5th up to the root up to the 9th. So we have that jump up of a 4th, and then we have a whole step after that. We want to think about both the scale degrees, but also the intervals, because that might allow us to manipulate it in different ways once we're in the tune. So our first step, again, might be to think, all right, can I just play this motive in each one of these keys? Again, that's a little bit of an exercise. We want to move past that for this way of working, but it's going to end up sounding like this. Again, important starting place, but when we want to get past that, we got to look for ways that we can extend these motives, maybe connect them, maybe vary them. So before we hear the entire etude of this motivic kind of option, let's just look at the entire A section that I wrote just to see a couple things that are going on. So I start just the straight up motive that I just played, but then before I go to E flat, I do just play the same thing again, add a little pickup note, and then I go back down to the 5th. When I get to this D flat to C7 chord, I start by just playing the motive straight up, but then I'm thinking about how can I connect to the C7 chord and then extend that motive on the C7 chord to get me over to F. I think the key moment for me there is when I get to C7, I actually landed on the root. So rather than starting that motive on the 5th, I'm on the root of C7. I know I'm going to F. So I will actually think about, I'm building this motive in F again. So I have that C to F to G, that 4th up, and then that 2nd. That's not strictly in the C chord. In this part of the tune, there is a break, so you can kind of, fudge a little bit on what the harmony is. But even without that, you could still totally make that work, even if the rhythm section was totally playing C7, because the melody is very strong there. So we're going to sort of like make the connection as the listener that like, there might be a little bit of dissonance, but I recognize that little melodic chunk, so it all kind of works. Let's hear this full etude that I wrote myself for this example. There are a couple of other etudes that are available this week for people who are in the virtual studio over on Patreon. All three of them with complete etudes, complete play-alongs, all that kind of stuff. So you can check that out if you're interested, but I've just got this one for an example right now. You'll see, hopefully, I think, how I take this simple motive and manipulate it through the chord changes. Now, could I get every single one of these things to work out so nicely if I was straight up improvising this? Maybe not, probably not. In a couple of these cases, there's a few places where it was a little tricky to sort of hear how the through line needed to work. That's the goal of composition, is it gives us time to work through these. And you do this on a handful of tunes, you can start to make some connections that if you were just always doing it right with the metronome, right with the play along, right with real musicians, it might be hard to do in time. So let's check out this entire etude. Cool. Hopefully that illustrates some of this stuff in a relatively clear fashion, and you can see kind of what the end result of this kind of workflow would be. Try this in your own practice. I think it's really, really useful. It is a little time consuming. You know, it's going to take you some time to do this. I find a lot of times people find the rhythmic aspect of this to be quite challenging if you're not really accustomed to writing out music that you're hearing in your head. But do some work on it, take it slow, work on it on a simple tune so that you have, a little bit of wiggle room. You're not worried about both a difficult tune and trying a new concept. I really think it pays good dividends in your practice, and also it just develops sort of that like creative side of your musicianship. Maybe you write a tune that becomes a good tune. It becomes like a contrafact for whatever tune you are working on. You could like trot it out on a gig. That is a great way to develop material as not only an improviser, but also just a whole musician. Cool. We'll see you in the woodshed.